Invincible is feminist propaganda. Now, I must admit that I did enjoy the fight scenes in this show. Unfortunately, that's right about where my enjoyment ended, because most of it is poorly written, juvenile, and amateurish. Now, before I hop into it, I want all of you to keep a few things in mind, so pay attention. I called it propaganda, which implies that the subliminal messaging is done consciously and on purpose. But that might not actually be the case. The subliminal feminist messaging by which this show has been thoroughly saturated has also been slowly injected into our culture for decades. At this point, certain aspects of feminism have become so deeply ingrained into the psychology of our culture that they have become the default operating system used by hundreds of millions of people, all of whom believe that they are the ones from which these thoughts are originating, and that their minds are impervious to any outside manipulation. My point is that whether the writers consciously included such a vast amount of brain mush, or if it is just a subconscious consequence of being subjected to a lifetime of feminist propaganda, is not what's important. Very often, unbrainwashed people overlook this since they think it doesn't affect them. The part that is significant and that everyone needs to realize is the parasitic feminist ideology that has invaded the writers' brains is injected into the things they create, whether they're aware of it or not. Which brings us to the show Invincible being one of their infected creations. Movies and shows don't manifest out of thin air. They're created by real people with real psychology. Behind every scene, there is a real reason why the writers made the characters act a certain way, why they framed the scene a certain way, or why they included the scene at all. And this is still the case even when the show frequently includes scenes that appear to have little to no relevance to the story whatsoever. Media is prime real estate for planting new thoughts into your subconscious mind without your pesky psychological defenses getting in the way, because you're trying to relax, which means your guard is down. All it takes is a tiny bit of it to resonate with you before it slowly starts growing on you, insidiously infecting your perception of the world without you even thinking twice about it. It's very sneaky, and they do this with many more ideas than just feminism. There is most definitely a reason why these scenes were included, but we'll cross those bridges when we come to them later in the video. In case you haven't seen the show but are planning on watching it, I will be spoiling the entirety of the current season. These are the characters in the show whom I will be frequently referring to. We've got Nolan Grayson, aka Omni-Man, Mark Grayson, aka Invincible, Eve, Amber, William, Debbie Grayson, the mom, and I'll bring up others as I go along. We begin on a regular day in front of the White House when suddenly trouble breaks out. The evil blue twins are causing mayhem, and just as one of the helpless male guards is attacked, the first superhero on the scene, war woman, swoops in to save this pathetic, worthless man. Just as a side note, it's never mentioned why these supervillains are even trying to kill the president, or why they are rushing the front door of all places to do it. They say that after killing the president, no one will be able to stop them. Killing the president is not going to topple the US military, so unless they just have a grudge, this plot point doesn't really make sense. And as it turns out, there really is no point, because it's never brought up again. I only bring so much attention to it because I need you guys to understand just how juvenile and amateurish the writers are. This is evasive writing to fill the gaps while the authors wait for good spots to insert the narrative that they actually want to convey in the story. The author's inherent male guilt due to feminist brainwashing was either accidentally projected onto the show, or it was added on purpose because they are that far gone. In this particular case, I'm gonna bet that this was more subconscious projection as opposed to conscious addition. Nevertheless, War Woman is our first example of many Mary Sues to come in this show. In case you don't know what a Mary Sue is, on Wikipedia it's defined as a fictional character, usually a young woman, who is portrayed as unrealistically free of weaknesses. Originating in fan fiction, a Mary Sue is often an author's idealized self-insertion. Mary Sue stories are often written by adolescent authors. See why I said the writing was juvenile? And I didn't even look that part up until I was making the script. But when it's this thick, you can sense it without having to look anything up, just by watching the show. Every woman in this show is attempted to be displayed as this perfect girl with no flaws that everyone in the show idolizes. Even the villains.
War Woman. Please, you couldn't just sit this one out. Let us kill the president. You earned a day off.
Not our style. Sorry.
Everyone gather round. Look at the strong girl boss that even the villain can't help but admire. It's so painfully forced. A well-written story fleshes out the plot in a way that reveals the characters' personalities. That's what makes a show immersive. But with Invincible, you're in a constant state of agitation, because anytime you begin to enjoy the show, it's not long before you're bombarded with more blatant feminist insertions. Finally, we are introduced to Mark Grayson, the main character, aka Invincible. But he doesn't have his superpowers yet, even though he's already 17 years old, much to the disappointment of his father. Which brings us to the main theme of the entire show, and spoiler alert, it's not about superpowers. In this show, superpowers represent masculinity. I'm gonna say that again. In this show, superpowers represent masculinity. For the most part, kids in real life view their fathers as superheroes too, or at least those with good fathers do. This aspect of the show is a metaphor for the current real life state of relationships between this generation of sons and their fathers. Paired with the decline in masculinity is the rise in lipstick, ineffective, and effeminate men. And I'm guessing the writers are part of this increasing demographic. An entire generation of men who just don't make the cut. They have routinely disappointed their fathers in all areas applicable to men. And Invincible is not the only show that has addressed this phenomenon either. This new generation of men is indirect, ineffective, and most notably, insecure about their heterosexuality. And we won't have to wait long to observe an example of this, because as fate would have it, the very next scene beautifully displays this exact point. Omni-Man gets back from dealing with the evil twins and kisses his wife affectionately. It's not overdone and a very standard part of marriage. Mark, however, is violently uncomfortable, even though he's not even looking in their direction. The knowledge alone that his parents are expressing their heterosexuality is enough to make him shrink into himself and slink upstairs. Now, this is actually a frequently used attempt at comedy in American media. A very unsuccessful attempt, I might add, where the parents embracing is enough to make the children so insecure that they verbally object to any form of heterosexual expression. This is not the case for homosexual expression in media. In fact, it's actually encouraged and everybody watches it. And if you don't watch it and you don't enjoy it, you're called a homophobe. And again, this display of affection is pretty mild. He didn't catch them in bed together. They're just kissing real quick, and he wasn't even looking. But he's so out of touch with his sexuality, so sexually repressed, and in denial of his own masculinity and his own masculine desires, that even that much defeats him. His parents then discuss flying to a foreign country for some exclusive food options, and he wants to go. But he can't because he's got school. But then his father adds this.
When your powers kick in, you can go on your own.
Salt on the wound, Dad.
They've got to be due any day now, son.
This translates to, your masculinity will kick in any day now. This is a crucial moment in which we need to tie real life and the projections in the show together. Very often in real life, when men have kids, even if it's on purpose and they plan on having a family and being a dad and whatnot, men get distracted by their purpose in life. So even if he's a nice dad who is present in the home and provides financially for his kids, I don't think it would be inaccurate to say that most fathers, at least in this day and age, do not consciously teach their sons about masculinity or being in touch with their power as a man. And it's been this way for decades now. For nearly a century, generations of men in America have found themselves at a loss as to how to define themselves as a man, or where they stand in the world, which leaves them wide open and vulnerable to brainwashing. And that's not even counting the fatherless men either. Boys growing up in this era have been taught close to nothing about masculinity, or how to relate to their own and channel it in productive ways. Because if they were, they would not be easy to control. They would be mentally strong and grounded within their own authority as men. The people in control don't want men in control of themselves, because when men are weak, so is the rest of society, including women and children. Men are like the eggshell around the yolk of the egg that protects it while it is growing. If the eggshell is soft, any outside force can easily penetrate the egg and destroy everything inside. This next scene is also extremely important because there's not only a lot of feminist narrative, but a noticeable amount of racial narrative as well. Mark is walking out of the house and tries jumping up and down to activate his flying abilities, and the ultra cool black mailman walks by and glares at him for seemingly no reason. Have you ever met a mean mailman? What reason would this black mailman have for giving Mark a dirty look just for acting silly? I'll tell you why. Anytime there is no relevant reason for the rudeness, you can bet it's a projection by the authors. Liberals, and more specifically the liberals who write this show, don't actually see non-white people as equals. They see non-white people as pitiful, subhuman creatures. Almost human, but not quite as smart and not quite as capable as whites. And because they feel guilty about this prejudice towards other races, they project it onto anybody who doesn't see non-white people this way in order to distance themselves from the fear that someone might find out about their prejudice. That's why liberals feel the need to force diversity in schools and workplaces, as well as virtue signal in other areas. More relevantly though, that's the reason why non-white people in this show are never really given a hard time for any significant reason. Anytime whites are shown in the same scene with non-white races, they are routinely portrayed as goofy, annoying, and dim-witted in an unspoken comparison to the ultra-cool, intelligent, and charming non-white people. If there was a Mary Sue for races, the non-white people in this show would be the Mary Sue. No joke is ever made at their expense, and there is never a scene in this show solely meant to display the personal flaws of a non-white person or a woman, like there are scenes for the white male characters. This is liberal projection in the flesh. Any normal person, upon seeing Mark act silly, no matter what race or gender, would have simply laughed it off and said good morning or something back to Mark. Moving on, we take a look at Mark's social life, and of course, his one and only friend is the gay guy at school. Another symptom of emasculated men is being out of touch with your sexuality and your inner aggression as a man, which means you don't relate very well to other men and have a difficult time making friends with straight, masculine men. You are in resistance to that part of yourself. Therefore, you are in resistance to it when you sense it in other men as well. That is why Mark's only friend is a gay boy. It's never explicitly addressed why Mark's only friend is this particular person. And this is because there isn't an explicit reason, other than that it's another liberal projection by the authors. Speaking of liberal projections, we hop immediately into yet another one where the writers introduce us to Amber, the absolute worst character I have ever had the misfortune of witnessing. The epitome of feminism, and a Mary Sue. Along with her comes Todd, the contrasting epitome of what feminists would call toxic masculinity, and stereotypical high school jock whose archetype doesn't seem to have budged a smidgen since its origination in the 1960s. Todd, predictably, is harassing Amber, who is clearly making it known that she does not appreciate his advances. And this complete buffoon just can't take no for an answer. Typical man, right? Insisting instead that he knows Amber likes him. And like the good little white knight that Mark is, he steps in to save the day, only to get the shit beaten out of him. Good news though, Amber comes in to save Mark and oh so predictably kicks Todd in the balls. Wow, how original. The authors really outdid themselves with this one. Do I even need to mention this is more projection? White knighting is the pinnacle of every emasculated man's list of fantasies. The message here is actually twofold, and the other half is one that emasculated men love to push incessantly. It's that even though they are weak, and even though they know they are weak, they deal with this not by becoming stronger, but by coping and telling themselves that being emasculated is actually a secret strength, and that if it ever came down to it, they would come out on top. They just haven't truly tried yet. It's like the quiet kid that pretends if they ever got angry, they'd be able to beat up anyone in the room, even though they don't actually know anything about fighting. They know they are lame and ineffective as men, and instead of fixing this, they lie to themselves. Similarly to how women lie to themselves about their own insecurities. What's important to understand is these men are not men. They are boys that never grew up. And boys that never grow up turn into women. See, contrary to turning into a woman, which is something that will happen to a girl whether she wants to or not, a man is something that you have to become. And just like how a girl will turn into a woman whether she wants to or not, so will a boy if he does not turn himself into a man. One thing I wanted to point out was that while I was watching this show, I made a game for myself to predict every scene before it happened. And anytime I played this little game, I was right. In fact, I was so accurate that I would predict each action before it happened, the character performing it, and what they would say afterwards. Have you ever been disappointed that you were right? That just about sums up how I felt. And here it is, we have finally arrived at the moment that Mark gets his superpowers. Make no mistake, however, this does not change the dynamic of the characters' relationships. This is only for plot development. This next bit shows Mark's dad, Nolan, aka Omni-Man, training Mark. This can essentially be translated to his father teaching him about his masculinity. And it seems like this is one of the few times in his life that he's ever gotten an official conversation about it. This is the mistake countless men make with their sons. They only start talking to them about masculinity and about being a man when they are right about to leave the nest. But it is too late, because by this point, they will have already developed a rough outline for themselves and how they will interact with the world. And unfortunately, the only other people these boys are surrounded by when they create this outline are other emasculated men, adolescent boys, and bitter, boy-hating feminists. Most men for decades now have been deprived of positive masculine role models, and so is Mark, which is why he's such a spineless boy, even at 17 years old. Nolan has a moment where he punches Mark too hard, but because of the fact that he waited too long to teach Mark this lesson, this comes as a disillusioning shock rather than a simple challenge Mark can use to grow as a man and as a superhero. This moment is also representative of when a father in real life has waited too long to begin instilling the values of masculinity into his son. These values are now lost on the son because they seem too difficult or too painful to grasp. They seem harsh when really they're just the reality of life. Mark has to be able to get roughed up if he wants to be a superhero, aka a masculine man like his dad. What the feminists do is they disregard masculinity and they cast it out. They lie to men and tell men that they don't need to be strong and that they should forsake their masculinity, when really what they need to do is dive deeper into their masculinity and grow out of the soft, boyish mindset that they've had up to this point. This next point is super significant, so pay attention. When Mark and Nolan get home, the mom asks Nolan if he pushed Mark too hard, to which Nolan replies, "Are you challenging me?" A common reoccurrence I've noticed when wives resist the masculine authority of their husbands, and then the husband snaps back at her, is that the feminists will use this as an example of toxic masculinity, when really it's just one of those times where you have to suck it up and do as you're told. They'll claim the father is insecure and feels threatened in his fragile masculinity, when really it is the wife and the children that need to surrender to the authority of the man and ground themselves. Now, of course, I'd be remiss if I neglected to mention that there is a mountain of difference between a healthy, grounded, masculine father and an insecure little worm of a boy who never grew up and has somehow managed to have children and is now using them as emotional punching bags for his failings as a man. However, this video is not about abusive fathers, so I will have to save that topic for another time. Returning to the show, however, Mark stops a bank robbery and his father shows up to pick him up. While chatting on a rooftop, Mark admits to his father that he wants to be just like him. And while this seems like an innocent desire at first, this might not be what Mark wants for himself. And the reason for this is revealed later in the show. Feminism, after all, seeks to destroy men. And our indoctrinated feminist writers are not out to create a story about embracing masculinity. But that's all I'll reveal for now. We now come to yet another crucial point of what I want you guys to remember from this video. Women's lack of importance in raising children, and the lengths to which they're willing to stretch to maintain their emotional umbilical cord with the child past its maturity point. Initially, it's for the child, and she feeds into the child. But in this modern day, women maintain the emotional umbilical cord to sap from their children, which is where this massive influx of nice guys and effeminate men comes from. They do this in an attempt to fill their own emotional void. Mark is practicing in the backyard, and when his mother catches him, she insists that he go to bed. Now, this might come off as standard motherly scolding. See, women will all too often use their children as emotional puking buckets, and nobody bats an eye. But this is incredibly abusive and stressful for the child. This trains the child not to be able to regulate their own emotions because they're so worried about monitoring yours. The mom expresses regret at this new dynamic between Mark and his father. Now that Mark is learning how to be a superhero, aka a man, and is no longer one of her little gossip pets. She can't even be happy that Mark and Nolan are finally bonding for the first time in their lives because she's so butthurt over the fact that she has to acknowledge that Mark has drastically outgrown his adolescent years. But because Mark is such an invertebrate, he expresses that he doesn't feel like a superhero, aka a man. His mom even tries reassuring him, but he insists that he is not enough. Then she says this.
What if the greatest me isn't enough?
Mark, you stupid boy. How could the greatest you not be enough?
What this translates to is the lie men are told when seeking reassurance from women, and why reassurance should never be sought from women. It sounds a little something like this. No matter how powerless and wimpy you are, I will still love you. And because so many men have fallen for this lie, we now have a masculinity shortage. Your mother will never tell you the truth if she knows what you want to hear, and neither will a woman with whom you're romantically involved. There is no negative consequence that your mother suffers for giving you false reassurance. And as far as your lover goes, she'll just cheat on you or straight up leave you. Suddenly, you're just not enough for her anymore. You're not enough of a man for her anymore, even though that's exactly what she was telling you a few days earlier. Another psychological undertone this subtly displays is that you should always listen to your mother, you stupid boy. How could you possibly know any better? Feminism pushes this mansplaining narrative pretty hard, and yet women routinely get away with these subtle manipulations of the same nature because they are experts at sniffing out moments of weakness and slipping these subtle suggestions into your brain. None of this, by the way, would be such a problem if at literally any point during the show Mark grew a pair. Maybe he got comfortable throwing his weight around, or just became a more charismatic, confident person. However, there is no character development for Mark. He stays a whiny bitch the whole show, and that's because his character is not real. In fact, none of the characters in this show are real, and this is because the writers are only interested in projecting a fantasy, not writing a story and letting the story develop the characters. We're near the end of the episode now, and Omni-Man calls all the Guardians to the base for the sole purpose of slaughtering them. Now, we don't find out why until the end of the season, but I'll save the rest of the episodes for later videos. Whew! That was a lot to cover, but we got through it. And I didn't even cover all of it, to be honest. There were actually a lot of moments that I even left out because I felt like it would be nitpicking, but I'm pretty sure we got all the most important ones out there. One bit I want to re-emphasize is I don't think the authors consciously added every bit of feminist brainwashing. I think the authors are just a group of deeply indoctrinated man-children who wanted to make a comic book about superheroes. Regardless of whether they were conscious about it or not, the subliminal messaging affects its audience nonetheless, so it must be dissected. Without dragging it on too much longer, that's going to be it for this video. If you would like me to dissect the rest of the Invincible episodes, make sure to smash that like button. Let me know what you think in the comments down below. If you've already watched the show, were there any moments that you hadn't noticed before watching this video? I'm definitely interested in hearing which ones those were. Make sure to subscribe if you're not already, and click the bell so that you never miss a new upload. I'm going to be uploading on YouTube a lot more often. This just happened to be a much longer project of mine. Most of my videos will not take this long to make. With that being said though, thanks again for watching, and I will see you guys in the next video. Take care.